You think you know Cinderella. A kind girl, a fairy godmother, a glass slipper that fits her and no one else. A prince searches the kingdom, finds his bride, and they live happily ever after. It's the cleanest, gentlest fairy tale we tell our children. But the version Disney gave you is a sanitized fragment of something far older, far stranger, and in its earliest forms, considerably more horrifying. Because in the story's original European tellings, that slipper wasn't just a test of size. It was an instrument that drove desperate women to mutilate their own bodies, and in some versions, drove the prince to discover that fact in the most gruesome way imaginable. Once you understand what the slipper actually represented and what people actually did to fit into it, you'll never look at this story the same way again. Let's begin. The version most of us know traces back to Charles Perrault's 1697 French telling, the one with the glass slipper and the fairy godmother. It's elegant, magical, bloodless. But the brothers Grimm, when they collected the German variant a little over a century later, in 1812, preserved something Perrault had carefully scrubbed away. In their version, titled Aschenputtel, there is no fairy godmother, there is no pumpkin coach. And when the prince's messenger arrives at the stepsister's house carrying the golden slipper, what happens next reads less like a fairy tale and more like a crime scene report. The eldest stepsister tries the shoe first. It doesn't fit. Her foot is too large. So her mother, watching her daughter struggle, hands her a knife and tells her plainly that a foot which doesn't fit can simply be made to fit. The text states it without flinching. Cut off the toe. The shoe will press. When you are queen, you will not have to walk on foot anymore. The girl, desperate for the throne, takes the blade to her own foot. She slices off her toe, forces her bleeding stump into the slipper, and limps out to meet the prince, masking her agony behind a forced, triumphant smile. The prince, believing he has found his bride, lifts her onto his horse, and they ride away together. Picture that scene as the Grimms wrote it, a cramped, candlelit room. The mother's voice flat and businesslike, as if she's instructing her daughter on adjusting a hem rather than ordering an amputation. The eldest daughter sitting on a low stool, foot extended, jaw clenched. The knife catching candlelight for a single instant before it does its work. No anesthetic, no mercy. Just a mother calmly mutilating her own child's body because a throne was worth more than a toe. It almost works. The prince and his new bride ride off together, but they don't get far. As they pass a hazel tree growing beside the path, two doves perched in its branches begin to sing, and their song is reported word for word in the original German text. Turn and look, turn and look. There's blood within the shoe. The shoe is too small. The true bride waits for you at home. The prince looks down. Blood is seeping through the golden leather, staining the horse's flank red. He turns the horse around immediately and rides the impostor back to her own house in disgust. The second stepsister fares no better, though her mutilation is different and, if anything, even more grotesque. Her foot is too narrow at first attempt. Then the slipper simply will not seat properly because her heel protrudes too far. So her mother hands her the same knife with the same flat instruction. Cut off a piece of your heel. The girl, just as desperate as her sister, complies. She slices away a portion of her own heel, jams her ruined foot into the slipper, bites down on her own scream, and rides off triumphant beside the prince. And once again, as they pass the same hazel tree, the same two doves sing the same warning. Blood within the shoe. The prince looks down again. Blood pools where her heel should be. He turns back a second time, delivering her home in the same horrified silence. Only then, after two mutilated women have already been paraded as false brides and returned in disgrace, does the prince ask if there is another daughter in the house. Cinderella, filthy from the ashes she sleeps among, is brought out as an afterthought, almost an embarrassment to the family. Her foot slides into the slipper perfectly, no blood, no force, no violence required. The thing the text makes unmistakable, almost cruelly so, is that the shoe was never magic. It fit one body and one body only, and everyone else in that house was willing to draw blood rather than accept that the throne was never meant for them. Why would two young women raised in the same household mutilate their own feet for a marriage? To understand that, you have to understand exactly what was at stake in the world the Grimms were drawing from. In the German territories of the early modern period, a woman's marriage prospects were essentially her entire economic future. There was no independent income, no career, no inheritance path for daughters in most households beyond what a husband could provide. A marriage to nobility, let alone to a literal prince, represented the single greatest economic event that could happen to a woman in her lifetime. A permanent escape from poverty, servitude, or dependency on relatives who resented feeding an extra mouth. Against that backdrop, the loss of a toe or a sliver of heel is not an act of insanity. It's a coldly rational trade, horrifying only because the prize being gambled for was so enormous and the body being sacrificed was considered, by the very mother doing the cutting, expendable in comparison. And this is where the story's true brutality reveals itself, because the mutilation in Aschenputtel was never really about Cinderella at all. It's a story about what mothers were willing to do to their own daughters, and what daughters were willing to do to themselves when a household's entire survival depended on marrying well. The stepmother in this tale isn't simply cruel for cruelty's sake. She is operating inside a system that has convinced her that her daughters' bodies are tools to be optimized for a transaction, and she applies that logic with the same calm efficiency she might use directing a servant. Cut here. It will fit. You won't need to walk far anyway. The foot itself carried enormous symbolic weight in medieval and early modern European culture that's almost entirely lost on modern audiences. A small, dainty, unblemished foot was read as a direct signal of aristocratic status because it meant a woman had never needed to labor, never walked barefoot through fields, or stood for hours at physical work. Large, calloused, or rough feet marked the laboring classes instantly and permanently. The size of a foot wasn't a neutral physical trait in this world. It was a body literally bearing the evidence of a person's social class, written into bone and skin through years of either privilege or toil. When the slipper rejects the stepsister's feet, the tale is making an almost unbearably literal statement. Their bodies have already been shaped by a lower position in the world, and no amount of self-mutilation can manufacture the proof of nobility their blood never gave them. Cinderella's foot fits not because of magic, but because the story insists, however cruelly, that some truths about bloodline and worth cannot be faked, no matter how much flesh you're willing to cut away trying. This obsession with foot size as a marker of class and worth wasn't confined to German folklore. It echoes, disturbingly, across cultures that the Brothers Grimm almost certainly never encountered directly, which is part of what makes the pattern so unsettling to historians who study it. In 9th century China, centuries before the Grimms ever picked up a pen, a story called Ye Xian was recorded featuring a persecuted girl, a magical fish, and a tiny golden slipper that only she could wear, leading to her eventual marriage to a king. The structural echo to Cinderella is so exact that some folklorists consider it among the earliest known ancestors of the tale type. But what makes the Chinese context especially chilling is the practice that emerged in that same broader culture roughly 1,000 years later. Foot binding, the deliberate, agonizing breaking and folding of young girls' feet, beginning sometimes as early as age 4 or 5, specifically to produce the smallest possible foot, because tiny feet became, in later imperial China, the single most prized physical attribute a woman could possess in the marriage market. The process itself is almost too brutal to describe plainly, yet the historical record insists on plainness, because softening it would betray exactly what generations of young girls endured. A girl's toes, except the big toe, would be folded under and bound tightly against the sole of the foot with long strips of cloth, often by her own mother or grandmother, the people she trusted most in the world, performing the procedure out of genuine love and fear for her future. The arch was forced to break and bow upward. The bindings were tightened progressively over years, the foot rewrapped every few days, the girl forced to walk on her own broken bones to help reshape them. Infection and gangrene were common. Toes sometimes had to be amputated when circulation failed completely, and the resulting foot, once healed into its final crushed shape, was rarely longer than 4 inches. Mothers performed this on daughters they loved, because an unbound foot meant an unmarriageable daughter, and an unmarriageable daughter meant a lifetime of poverty and shame for the entire family. The exact same calculation the German stepmother makes with her kitchen knife. except stretched across years instead of compressed into a single desperate afternoon, and inflicted not on a stepdaughter someone resented, but on a beloved daughter someone was terrified of losing to destitution. This is the thread that connects Cinderella's bloodied slipper to foot binding on the other side of the world, and to other documented practices like it across European peasant cultures, where tight, cheap, ill-fitting shoes were sometimes deliberately worn by young women trying to mimic the appearance of aristocratic smallness their feet didn't naturally have. The human foot, across wildly different cultures with no direct contact, became a battlefield for the same brutal arithmetic: female worth measured in inches of bone, and families willing to break, bind, or slice that bone to purchase a daughter's future. Once you see that arithmetic clearly, the rest of Cinderella's story reorganizes itself in front of you. The ball isn't a romantic dance. It's a public marriage auction, and every detail the prince later uses to identify his bride functions as a verification process for aristocratic bloodline, dressed up as a love story so that audiences would accept it without questioning what was actually being measured. The stepsisters aren't simply jealous. They are women trapped in the same brutal system as Cinderella, just on the losing side of it. Women who understood perfectly well that their economic survival depended on convincing a prince their bodies matched a standard they knew, deep down, didn't naturally belong to them. Their mother isn't a cartoon villain. She is a woman who has internalized her daughter's bodies as commodities and is willing to damage that commodity in the hope of increasing its market value. The exact same logic that drove a foot-binding mother on the other side of the planet to break her daughter's arches with the same tools she used to mend their clothes. And the doves singing from the hazel tree, the detail Disney never touches, exist in the original tale as something closer to a forensic mechanism than a magical flourish. They are the story's built-in lie detector, the device that makes the lower-class mutilation visible no matter how well it's hidden inside a golden shoe. Blood within the shoe. No amount of cutting, binding, or forcing can fully erase the evidence of what a body has been put through to fake a status it was never born into. The slipper, in the end, was never a romantic object. It was a measuring instrument, and the original story understood, with a clarity modern adaptations have spent centuries trying to forget, that measuring instruments, calibrated to class and beauty, have always, throughout history, been instruments that someone, somewhere, was willing to bleed to pass. The next time someone tells you Cinderella is a sweet story about a girl who simply waited patiently for her prince, remember the version that came before the singing mice and the pumpkin carriage. Remember a mother handing her daughter a knife. Remember two doves singing about blood inside a golden shoe. Remember that across an ocean, in a culture the Grimms never knew existed, mothers were doing essentially the same thing to their own daughters, with cloth instead of steel. For exactly the same reason, the glass slipper was never about finding the one foot that fit. It was about exposing every foot that didn't, and what desperate people have always been willing to do about that difference.